Somewhere beyond anything you can see, a meeting is happening, and you are not invited to it. The sons of God present themselves before the Lord, the text says, and Satan comes among them. And God himself, unprompted, brings up a single human being by name. Have you considered my servant Job? There is no man like him on the earth, blameless and upright, one who fears God and turns away from evil. You need to understand how strange this opening actually is, because most people who know the outline of Job's story have never actually noticed how it begins. This isn't a story about a man who sins and gets punished. It opens with God bragging about someone. Job is introduced, in the very first verse of the book, as a man in the land of Uz who was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. A man with 7 sons and 3 daughters, 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 donkeys, the text says, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. Whatever else this book is about to do to him, it wants you to know, in its very first breath, that Job was not secretly guilty of anything. He was, by every measure the text gives you, the real thing. And the very next thing that happens is Satan turning that praise into a challenge. Does Job fear God for nothing? Satan asks. Have you not put a hedge around him, and his house, and all that he has, on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. Notice what Satan is actually accusing Job of here. Not wrongdoing, not secret sin. He is accusing Job's faith itself of being a transaction, suggesting that Job only loves God because God has made it profitable to. Take away the profit, Satan says, and you'll see what's really underneath. And here is the detail that should stop you, because it changes how you read everything that follows. God does not defend Job by promising nothing bad will happen to him. He does something almost unbearable to picture. He gives Satan permission. Behold, all that he has is in your hand, only against him do not stretch out your hand. The hedge Satan complained about doesn't disappear completely, but it moves. Everything Job owns is now on the table. If this framing feels uncomfortable, a God who allows this kind of test at all, that discomfort is worth sitting with rather than rushing past, because the book of Job spends its entire length wrestling with exactly that question, and it never gives you an easy answer. This channel exists to walk through the hard chapters, not just the comfortable ones. The disasters arrive almost too fast to process, one messenger arriving before the last one has even finished speaking, a structure the original text preserves almost like a drumbeat, 4 blows landing in a single scene with no pause between them. Oxen and donkeys, stolen by raiders, every servant watching them killed. Fire falls from the sky and burns up the sheep and the servants tending them. Camels are stolen by a raiding party in 3 separate bands, more servants killed. And then, while that messenger is still speaking, one more arrives. Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead, and I alone have escaped to tell you. 4 messengers, 4 separate catastrophes, all of it, according to the text's own arrangement, compressed into what feels like the space of a single conversation. In the space of what feels like minutes, Job loses his entire livelihood and every one of his children in a single day. And here is where the story does something that should genuinely surprise you. Job tears his robe, shaves his head, the customary signs of grief in that culture, and falls to the ground. And then he worships. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, the text says, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. This is worth pausing on, because it would be easy to read this as Job simply being stoic, or numb, or performing piety he doesn't feel. The text doesn't describe a man who feels nothing. It describes a man who feels everything, and still chooses to bless the name of the God who allowed it. Satan's accusation, that Job's faith is only a transaction, has just failed its first test completely. So Satan escalates. In a second heavenly scene, God again brings up Job by name, noting that he still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason. And Satan's answer reveals exactly what he thinks will finally break a man, skin for skin. All that a man has he will give for his life. But stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. Again, God gives permission, with one boundary: only spare his life. And Job is struck with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, a disease severe enough that he takes a piece of broken pottery to scrape himself, and sits down among the ashes, which in that culture was itself a public symbol of complete devastation, the lowest place a person of former honor and wealth could occupy. It is here, sitting in ashes, covered in sores, having buried all 10 of his children in a single day, that Job's wife speaks the only line the text records from her in the entire book. Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. Job's answer is worth remembering precisely because it doesn't pretend the suffering isn't real. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. This is where 3 friends arrive: Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, who hear of all this trouble that had come upon him, and travel from their own homes specifically to show him sympathy and comfort him. And for 7 days and 7 nights, they simply sit with him on the ground, and no one speaks a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. If you have ever sat beside someone in grief with nothing useful to say, notice that this silence is the one thing these 3 friends get completely right in this entire book. Everything they say after this silence ends will be, in one form or another, wrong. Because once the conversation actually begins, a very old and very tempting theology takes over the room. If Job is suffering this much, he must have done something to deserve it. Eliphaz suggests it gently at first: who that was innocent ever perished? And by the time Bildad and Zophar have taken their turns, the accusations sharpen considerably. Job's friends spend chapter after chapter insisting that suffering on this scale simply does not happen to genuinely innocent people, and so Job must be hiding something. Here is what makes this section of the book so remarkably honest. Job's friends are not portrayed as villains making things up maliciously. They are portrayed as sincere people defending a theology that sounds reasonable, that probably matches what most of their culture already believed, and that turns out, by the book's own ending, to be dangerously wrong. Eliphaz appeals to a vision he once had in the night, a spirit passing before his face, whispering that no mortal can be righteous before God. Bildad appeals to tradition: ask the former generation, he tells Job, and consider what the fathers have searched out, as if the accumulated weight of inherited wisdom should be enough to settle the question on its own. Zophar is the bluntest of the 3, telling Job outright that God is exacting from him less than his guilt deserves. 3 different arguments, 3 different styles of persuasion, all converging on the same conclusion: pain this size must have a cause this size, and the only cause that makes sense to them is hidden sin. Job refuses to accept their explanation, and refuses just as firmly to curse God the way his wife suggested. Instead, he does something almost nobody expects from him: he argues. He demands an audience with God directly, insisting on his own innocence, wrestling honestly with a God who seems, from where Job is sitting, to have become his enemy for no reason he can discover. "Oh, that I had one to hear me," he says at one point. "Behold, my signature. Let the Almighty answer me." If wrestling honestly with unanswered suffering is something you've experienced yourself, you are, in this particular book, in very old and very good company. And there is more of this kind of honest wrestling waiting in Scripture if you keep coming back here each week. After 30-some chapters of argument, a younger man named Elihu speaks up, frustrated with both sides, angry at Job for justifying himself rather than God, and angry at the 3 friends for failing to actually answer him. And then, finally, out of a whirlwind, God himself speaks. And here is the detail that should surprise you more than almost anything else in this book. God never answers Job's question. He never explains the wager in heaven. He never says a single word about Satan, or the conversation in the heavenly court, or why any of this happened. Instead, God asks Job a question of his own. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. And for 4 straight chapters, God walks Job through the wild, uncontrollable, magnificent scope of creation. The storehouses of snow and hail reserved for the day of battle. The wild donkey who laughs at the tumult of the city and scorns the shouting of a driver. The ostrich who deals cruelly with her young because God has made her forget wisdom. The war horse who laughs at fear and rushes into battle scenting it from far away. And finally 2 untamable creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan, described in language so overwhelming that no human tool or weapon can subdue either one. Not a single question in these 4 chapters is answerable by Job. That appears to be the entire point. God is not proving that Job's suffering was justified. He is proving how small the vantage point is from which Job, and every reader since, has been asking the question at all. Job's answer, when it finally comes, is not an explanation received. It's a surrender offered. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I despise myself, and repent in dust and ashes. Notice what actually changes for Job in this final scene. His circumstances haven't been restored yet when he says this. His children are still dead. His health is still ruined. What changes is smaller and, in its own way, larger. Job stops needing an explanation, because he has encountered, directly, the God he had only known secondhand before. And then, remarkably, God turns his attention to the 3 friends, and he is not gentle with them. My anger burns against you, he tells Eliphaz, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. The men who spent 30 chapters defending God's honor by insisting Job must deserve his suffering are told, directly, that they were the ones who got God wrong, and Job, who spent those same chapters honestly demanding answers and refusing easy explanations, is the one God calls right. The book ends with Job's fortunes restored, double what he had before, in fact, and 10 more children born to him. But it is worth resisting the urge to treat that ending as the point of the story. If restoration were the actual lesson, the book would have no reason to spend 30-some chapters making you sit inside unanswered suffering first. The wager Satan raised at the very beginning, does Job fear God for nothing, is answered not by Job getting his blessings back, but by Job continuing to seek God honestly through every single chapter where those blessings were gone and nothing was coming back yet. So here is what this story actually leaves you with, once you step back from all 42 chapters of it. First, the presence of suffering was never, in this book's own telling, proof of hidden sin. Job's friends were confident, sincere, and wrong, and God says so directly. Be careful with that same confidence in your own life, whether you're the one suffering or the one standing nearby with an explanation ready. Second, God never explained the wager to Job, and you are not owed an explanation for every hard thing in your own life either. What Job received instead of an explanation was an encounter, a direct, overwhelming reminder of exactly whose universe this actually is. And third, the one worth carrying with you longest. The question Satan asked at the very beginning, does Job fear God for nothing, is still, quietly, the question underneath every hard season anyone ever walks through. Would you still trust the God you follow if every single thing he ever gave you was taken away first? Job never got an answer to why. What he got, in the middle of the ashes, before a single blessing was restored, was God himself. And by the end of this book, that turns out to have been the entire point all along. It is worth noticing, too, what Job does immediately after encountering God, before any of his fortune is restored. He prays for the very friends who spent 30 chapters accusing him, and the text specifically says it is only after Job prays for his friends that the Lord restores his fortunes. Whatever bitterness 30 chapters of false accusation might have justified, Job's final act in the story is intercession, not vindication for its own sake. The man who once demanded an audience with God to argue his case ends the book using his restored standing to plead on behalf of the very people who wronged him. There is a reason this book has outlasted every attempt to reduce it to a simple lesson about patience. Job's patience is not, on close reading, passive at all. He argues, he demands, he refuses easy answers from every direction, including from his own wife. What the book actually commends is something harder to summarize in a single word. A faith that stays honest in the dark, that keeps addressing God directly even when God seems entirely silent, and that never once agrees to purchase relief by pretending to a guilt that isn't there.